The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale light over the quiet battlefield. Birds chirped in the distance, almost as if nothing terrible was about to happen. But everyone knew the calm was only temporary. On one side of the valley stood 40 tired and anxious soldiers, led by a Marine who was known for his courage and sharp mind. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces smudged with dirt and sweat, and their weapons were ready, but their hearts were pounding. The Marine looked at his men. Each soldier was young, most not older than 25. Some had been through battles before, some had never faced an enemy like this. The Marine's eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. Somewhere far away, hidden by the morning mist, thousands of enemy soldiers were preparing to charge. He knew the numbers. 3,000 bonsai warriors were coming straight at them. 40 against 3,000. The odds were impossible. The soldiers whispered to each other, fear written across their faces. "How can we stop them?" one of them asked quietly. Another shook his head, gripping his rifle tightly. The Marine didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His silence carried a strange confidence. He had seen fear before and he had seen courage too. He knew his men were scared, but he also knew they could do something no one expected. They were not just soldiers, they were the last line of defense in this small valley. Behind them was nothing but rocks, trees, and the wide open land. There was no backup. If they failed, the enemy would rush through and thousands more would follow. It was a nightmare scenario, a hopeless fight. And yet the Marine had a plan. A secret plan. Something that had never been tried before. The soldiers didn't know the details and no one else had ever seen it work. It was risky, so risky that if it failed it could cost them their lives. But if it worked it could change everything. The Marine knew that this trick might be their only chance to survive. He walked slowly among his men, checking their positions, speaking in low, calm tones. "Stay close. Stay alert. Remember what I taught you." His voice was steady, but inside he felt the weight of the challenge. He had done this before in smaller battles, but never against such overwhelming numbers. This was a test of courage, skill, and quick thinking. Every move would matter, and every second could be the difference between life and death. The soldiers tried to steady their nerves. They practiced their grips on their rifles, they checked their ammunition, they whispered prayers quietly under their breath. Some closed their eyes for a moment, trying to imagine the battle, hoping it would give them strength. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to let fear show. All of them looked toward their leader, the Marine, hoping for some sign that it could work. Then the first sounds came. Far in the distance, there was a low rumble, almost like thunder rolling over the hills. The Marine's eyes narrowed. He knew that sound well. It was the enemy approaching, thousands of footsteps moving together, unstoppable like a wave about to crash. The soldiers tensed. Some swallowed hard. One young private whispered, "This is it, isn't it?" The Marine didn't answer. He only nodded slightly and motioned for everyone to take their positions. He had taught them something strange, unusual, almost unbelievable. It was a trick that could make 40 men seem like a wall of hundreds, maybe thousands. No one had ever tried it in real combat. It required perfect timing, absolute focus, and complete trust in each other. And most importantly, it required courage that few men truly had. The Marine looked at his men and believed they had it. He believed they could turn fear into strength, panic into precision. The enemy was getting closer now. Shapes began to appear through the morning mist. Shadows moved in patterns too large to ignore. The soldiers could see the glint of weapons in the sunlight, the faces of warriors ready to fight and die. The roar of distant voices carried across the valley, growing louder and louder. Every heart in the Marines' group pounded with anticipation. Some felt frozen with fear. Some felt an adrenaline rush they had never known before. The Marine raised his hand, signaling them to be ready. He looked toward the horizon one last time. The secret trick, the forbidden plan, would need to be executed perfectly. There was no room for mistakes. Every soldier had a role. Every soldier had to believe in it. And then he whispered to himself, "This is the moment. This is what we were made for." As the first wave of enemies drew nearer, a thought crossed the Marine's mind. Could 40 men really stand against 3,000? Could a clever plan, a simple trick, turn the tide of battle? The answer would come soon enough. The soldiers held their breath. The enemy came closer. And the valley waited, silent but full of tension, for the storm that was about to break. How could just 40 men stop 3,000 enemies? That question hung in the air, unanswered as the calm of the morning vanished. The battle was about to begin, and history was about to be written in ways no one could imagine. The valley, once calm under the morning sun, began to hum with an uneasy tension. Every leaf on the trees, every shadow on the rocks seemed to vibrate with the approaching threat. 40 soldiers, tired but determined, waited silently under the command of their Marine leader. The Marine knew that in a few moments, their courage and skill would be tested like never before. The enemy was close, and the ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of thousands of advancing feet. From the mist in the distance, the first shapes of the enemy emerged. 3,000 bonsai warriors moved in perfect formation, a wave of green uniforms, rifles and bayonets glinting in the sunlight. Their shouts, first faint, began to grow louder, echoing across the valley. The sound carried an almost terrifying rhythm, like the beating of drums, but with the unmistakable menace of soldiers trained for relentless attack. The Marine's jaw tightened. He had faced danger before, but nothing like this. 40 against 3,000. The odds were impossible. The soldiers felt the same fear the Marine had felt that morning. Their hands trembled as they adjusted grips on their rifles. Some whispered quick prayers under their breath, while others focused on their positions, refusing to let fear show. The Marine walked slowly among them, scanning faces, checking gear, and offering quiet words of encouragement. Stay calm. Trust each other. Remember the plan. His voice was low, but it carried a quiet authority. Every man hung on his words. As the enemy drew closer, the Marine began to observe them carefully. He noticed the way they moved, the gaps between the soldiers, the slight hesitations in their lines. Every detail mattered. The Marine had spent years learning how to turn the smallest advantage into survival. He knew that courage alone would not be enough. They needed strategy. They needed precision. And above all, they needed timing. The soldiers tightened their formation. 40 men, spread carefully across a narrow stretch of land, like a thin line of steel ready to hold back a flood. The Marine's mind raced through the steps of his forbidden Brig trick. Every soldier had a role, and every move had to be perfect. If even one man made a mistake, it could spell disaster. Yet he also knew that if it worked, the results could shock the enemy and turn the impossible odds in their favor. The enemy's shouts grew louder, mingled with the sound of boots striking the earth in unison. Dust rose from the valley floor, swirling around the soldiers' feet. The Marine signaled them to hold steady. Every soldier froze, rifles raised, eyes locked on the advancing tide. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than it should. The valley felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Then the first steps of the enemy wave hit the line of sight. A sudden movement, soldiers breaking formation slightly, trying to push forward faster. The Marine's eyes sharpened. This was it, the first real test. He whispered to his men, "Remember what we practiced. Stay tight. Watch each other's backs." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but inside he felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The bonsai warriors began to charge, their numbers overwhelming, their rhythm unrelenting. 40 men against 3,000, it seemed impossible to stop them. Some of the younger soldiers flinched, almost paralyzed by fear. Others gritted their teeth, remembering the Marine's instructions, trusting his judgment. The leader's confidence was contagious, even in the face of near-certain danger. The Marine knew they couldn't just wait to be hit. He needed to act, and the timing had to be perfect. He raised his hand subtly, signaling the first part of the trick. Soldiers shifted slightly, creating a pattern that made them appear larger, stronger, and more numerous than they actually were. It was an optical illusion, a simple yet brilliant tactic that used movement, noise, and positioning to confuse the enemy. The Marine had used it before, but never on this scale and never against such overwhelming numbers. The bonsai warriors began to hesitate. Some stumbled over each other, unsure of the size and strength of the line in front of them. The Marine noticed the change immediately. The trick was working. A tiny spark of hope ignited among his soldiers. They held their positions tighter, moving in perfect sync, each man playing his part in the carefully rehearsed plan. The enemy roared again, attempting to push through, but the Marine's line held. Dust and smoke from the battlefield swirled around them, adding to the illusion that there were more defenders than there actually were. 40 men, perfectly coordinated, looked like 100, maybe even 200. The soldiers' fear began to turn into controlled determination. Every shout from the enemy, every step they took forward, only strengthened the soldiers' resolve. Through the chaos, the Marine kept his eyes on every detail, the way the soldiers moved, the small gaps forming, the rhythm of the enemy's attack. His mind calculated the next steps, adjusting silently. The trick was only halfway through. The enemy was still overwhelming, and one misstep could undo everything. But the Marine trusted his men. He trusted their courage, their discipline, and their willingness to follow a plan that seemed almost impossible. As the enemy advanced closer, the valley became a tense stage for what could either be a disaster or a miracle. The soldiers were ready, the Marine was ready, and the forbidden trick was about to face its ultimate test. The first wave of warriors would soon reach their line. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum. Every breath carried the weight of history. The impossible fight had begun. The roar of thousands of feet grew louder with every passing second, shaking the valley floor. Dust rose around the 40 soldiers like a thick fog, covering their movements and making every shadow longer, darker, and more menacing. The Marine's eyes narrowed as he observed the advancing bonsai warriors. He had waited for this moment all his life. Every calculation, every plan, and every drill had led to this exact second. The secret trick, the one no soldier had dared to try before in a real battle, would soon be revealed. The soldiers held their ground, hearts pounding. Fear was still there, it would always be there, but it was now sharpened into focus. Each man remembered the Marine's words from the morning: trust the plan. Trust each other. We can do this. They didn't fully understand the trick yet, but they trusted the Marine's judgment. He had never let them down before, and his calm confidence was contagious. The Marine raised his hand, signaling the first stage of the plan. Immediately, the soldiers shifted positions slightly, almost imperceptibly. The movements were small, but they were calculated. Each soldier moved like a part of a single organism, designed to confuse the enemy and make their line appear stronger, larger, and more organized than it actually was. The trick was simple in theory but deadly in execution. 40 men needed to act like 100, like a wall that could not be broken. The first wave of enemy soldiers hit the edge of the valley. The bonsai warriors charged with full force, their cries echoing through the air like thunder. They expected fear and hesitation, but instead they were met with controlled, coordinated movement. The 40 men shifted, raised their rifles, and even their shadows seemed to multiply in the dusty light. The illusion worked instantly. For a moment the enemy paused, confused by what they saw. The Marine's eyes scanned the battlefield, noting every small detail. A slight hesitation here, a misstep there, it was working. The enemy didn't know where to strike first. Should they attack the left flank or the right? Could they break the line in the center? The Marine's trick had turned the battlefield into a puzzle, one the enemy couldn't solve quickly. And that pause, that tiny hesitation, was exactly what his soldiers needed. The soldiers began to understand the plan. They moved in unison, shifting slightly left and right, stepping forward just enough to create the illusion of strength. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong step could reveal the truth and give the enemy an advantage. Yet even in their fear, the soldiers trusted their leader and each other. The Marine's voice cut through the chaos in low, calm commands: hold. Now. The bonsai warriors, trained for direct assault and brute force, found themselves hesitant. They had expected to overwhelm a small group, but instead, they were met with a strange and unpredictable pattern. The Marine's trick was working better than anyone could have imagined. Dust clouds, raised rifles, and the subtle, synchronized movements of 40 soldiers created the illusion of a massive, unyielding wall. Enemy soldiers stumbled over each other, trying to find a weak point that didn't exist. The Marine didn't allow his soldiers to relax. He moved among them, scanning, observing, and giving small signals. He knew that the next stage of the trick would require even more precision. The first shock of confusion was over, but the enemy would recover quickly if the soldiers didn't act perfectly. The Marine whispered to himself, "Now comes the real test." Then the second part of the trick began. Small, sudden shifts, perfectly timed, created gaps that the enemy thought were weaknesses. Some bonsai warriors charged into these gaps, only to be met with fire from unexpected directions. 40 soldiers had become a wall, yes, but a wall that could strike, trap, and confuse. The Marine watched as enemy soldiers were forced to retreat and regroup, unsure of what they were facing. Each step forward by the Marine's men made the line appear stronger, the numbers larger, the courage greater. Even in the midst of battle, there was a strange beauty in the execution of the trick. It was like a dance, precise and deadly. The Marine's eyes shone with intensity as he coordinated every move. He could see the enemy's confusion growing with each passing second. His soldiers, once trembling with fear, now moved with quiet determination. They had begun to trust not just the Marine but themselves. The impossible task of standing against 3,000 warriors no longer seemed completely hopeless. And yet, the Marine knew the danger was far from over. One mistake, one slip could undo everything. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming. The roar of war was relentless, and the valley was filled with smoke, dust, and cries. But the trick, his secret trick, had bought them time, and in war time was life. Every second they held the enemy back increased their chance of survival. Every confused enemy soldier slowed the assault. Every careful, synchronized movement of his men brought them closer to turning the tide. The first shock wave of the enemy attack began to fade. The Marine signaled his soldiers to hold their ground firmly. The trick had worked, for now. But the battle was only beginning. The Marine looked over his line and saw courage in the eyes of each soldier. They had survived the first test. They had executed the impossible. And the forbidden Brig trick, the plan no one thought could succeed, had become their shield and weapon. The Marine knew that more waves would come, stronger and more relentless. But for the first time that day he allowed himself a brief, grim smile. 40 men had become a wall. 40 men had confused 3,000. And the secret, forbidden trick, the one that seemed impossible, had begun to turn the tide of what everyone thought was a hopeless battle. The battle was far from over, but the Marines' plan was working and the impossible was becoming real. The valley erupted into chaos. Dust clouds swirled around the 40 soldiers, and the sounds of war filled the air, shouts, gunfire, and the relentless thunder of thousands of advancing feet. The Banzai warriors, their formation slightly confused by the Marines' Brig trick, charged forward with terrifying speed. But the 40 men were ready. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat had been carefully prepared for this moment. The Marine's eyes scanned the battlefield like a hawk. He had predicted the enemy's first move and had already signaled his men. Their rifles cracked in unison, bullets ripping through the mist toward the closest wave of soldiers. The Banzai warriors stumbled, some falling to the ground, others halting briefly, unsure of the strength of the small line before them. It was a minor victory but a crucial one, the first proof that 40 men could resist an army of 3,000. The Marine shouted low, sharp commands, "Hold your ground. Move as one. Don't let them see weakness." His voice cut through the noise of the battlefield. The soldiers responded instantly, moving in perfect coordination. The Brig trick was now in full effect, every soldier playing his role flawlessly. To the enemy, it looked like a massive force, larger than reality, perfectly disciplined and impossible to break. The first wave of Banzai warriors reached the line. They surged forward with bayonets fixed, shouting war cries meant to intimidate. But the Marine soldiers held their positions. The synchronized movement of the 40 men created gaps and traps that confused the enemy. Soldiers who thought they had found a weak point were suddenly faced with rifle fire from unexpected angles. The illusion of a massive force held strong. Some of the younger soldiers faltered for a moment. Fear was still present, raw and biting. But the Marine's presence steadied them. He moved along the line, shouting encouragement, adjusting positions, ensuring no one broke formation. He was everywhere at once, a calm force amid the storm. Trust the plan. Trust each other. Fire together. Every command was precise, every moment calculated. The enemy tried to push through. They pressed on with overwhelming numbers, but the Marines' trick had bought the soldiers time. The line shifted subtly, creating new angles, new illusions of strength. Bullets flew, bodies fell, and dust rose thick over the valley floor. To anyone watching, it seemed impossible that 40 men could stand against thousands. And yet, there they were, holding firm. The clash continued, wave after wave of Banzai warriors striking with full force. The Marine adjusted constantly, reading the battlefield with unmatched skill. He noticed patterns, predicted movements, and used every opportunity to confuse the enemy. Small bursts of rifle fire, perfectly timed movements, and the careful use of terrain created the illusion of an army far larger than 40 men. The Banzai warriors began to hesitate more often, their confidence shaken. The soldiers themselves began to find courage they didn't know they had. The first shock of the enemy's advance had passed, and now they were reacting with skill and precision. Each man knew his role, who would fire, who would shift, who would create the illusion of strength. Fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into focus. The impossible fight felt almost achievable. Amid the chaos, the Marine noticed a gap forming in the enemy's line. A small group of warriors had charged too far ahead, separated from the rest. He signaled his soldiers quietly, a small, subtle gesture. Instantly they moved to take advantage. Rifle fire rained down from angles the enemy hadn't expected. Warriors who thought they had an opening were suddenly trapped in a deadly crossfire. The Brig trick was not just confusing the enemy, it was controlling them. The battle raged on. Soldiers fell, dust-coated faces and cries of pain echoed across the valley. But the 40 men held their ground. Each time the enemy pressed forward, the Marines' line shifted, creating the appearance of an even larger, unbreakable force. The Banzai warriors grew frustrated, their war cries mixing with confusion and panic. They had expected to overwhelm a small group easily, but they were facing a wall of tactics and courage that they had not anticipated. The Marine's mind worked faster than any weapon. He calculated positions, anticipated attacks, and guided his men with subtle gestures. The soldiers trusted him completely. They moved like one organism, shifting, firing, and holding positions exactly as they had trained. Every wave of the enemy that hit them faltered, unsure of how to proceed. The impossible was unfolding before their eyes. Even as exhaustion set in, the Marine refused to let his soldiers slow down. He encouraged them to keep moving, to keep firing, to maintain the illusion. Every second was crucial. Every moment of hesitation could allow the enemy to break through. But the soldiers responded with determination. They had seen the trick work and it had given them confidence. 40 men, once terrified, now felt unstoppable, if only for this moment. The first clash began to fade, but the battle was far from over. The Marine knew that more waves of Banzai warriors would come, stronger and more desperate. But the first test had been passed. 40 men had held the line against an impossible number. The valley, once calm, was now a scene of smoke, dust, and the echoes of war. But the Marine soldiers had survived the first assault. For a brief moment, the Marine allowed himself a glance at the faces of his men. Fear had been replaced by determination. The impossible seemed possible. And the forbidden Brig trick, executed perfectly under pressure, had turned the first wave of chaos into a strategic advantage. The battle was far from won, but the Marine and his 40 soldiers had proven that courage, skill, and clever tactics could hold back even the mightiest enemy. The first clash was over, but the real test was just beginning. The enemy would not stop, and neither would the Marines' resolve. The first clash had ended, but the valley was far from safe. Smoke and dust hung thick in the air, swirling around the 40 soldiers as they caught their breath. Bodies of the fallen littered the ground, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the distant shouts of the Banzai warriors regrouping. The Marine looked over his men, his sharp eyes calculating every detail. They had survived the first wave, but he knew the enemy would come again, and stronger this time. The soldiers wiped sweat and blood from their faces. Fear still gripped them tighter than ever. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of courage had begun to grow. They had seen the trick work. They had seen how 40 men could appear unstoppable, how precise movement and unity could confuse thousands. And now, despite exhaustion, they knew they had to fight harder. There was no other choice. From the horizon, the next wave began to form. The ground trembled under the weight of thousands of advancing feet. 3,000 enemy soldiers surged forward, their war cries echoing across the valley like a rolling storm. The Marine signaled his men to hold positions. "Remember your roles. Trust the plan. We are 40, but we are more than they can see," he commanded. Every word carried authority, every pause carried calm determination. The soldiers tightened their formation. Every rifle was ready. Every man knew the plan, but the fear of being overwhelmed was real. The Marine understood it too. 40 men against 3,000 was not just impossible, it was terrifying. Yet the forbidden Brig trick had given them hope, and hope could turn fear into determination. The enemy wave charged forward with renewed ferocity. Dust clouds rose, mixing with smoke and the cries of war. The first soldiers reached the line and were met with perfectly timed rifle fire. The illusion of numbers held again. 40 men moved in perfect synchronization, shifting, firing, and creating the appearance of a wall of hundreds. The Banzai warriors hesitated, confused by the tactics they did not understand. But the second wave was stronger, more coordinated, and more relentless. The enemy had learned from the first clash. They pressed harder, aiming for weaknesses. They tried to flank the line, to overwhelm small groups with sheer numbers. The soldiers felt the pressure. Each second was a test of their courage, each move a gamble with their lives. The Marine's mind raced. He could see patterns in the enemy's advance, small cracks in their formation. He adjusted the soldiers' positions instantly. Shift left. Cover the gap. Fire together. His commands were sharp, precise, and confident. The soldiers responded, moving as one, every man trusting the other completely. The line held, but just barely. The enemy was closing in, and the air was thick with tension and danger. Fear was everywhere. The younger soldiers trembled, the older soldiers gritted their teeth, and every heartbeat felt like it might be their last. Yet even in the midst of terror, the Marine's calm presence steadied them. He reminded them of the trick, of the power of unity, and of the illusion they were creating. They were no longer just 40 men, they were a force that the enemy could not comprehend. The enemy tried to push through the line, and for a moment, it seemed as if they might succeed. The soldiers fired rapidly, moving in perfect synchronization, but the sheer numbers of the enemy were overwhelming. Some of the men fell, hit by bullets or bayonets, but others held their ground, stepping into the gaps immediately, maintaining the illusion. The Marines' plan was working, but it was exhausting. Every second felt like an hour. Every action could be the difference between life and death. The bonsai warriors began to adapt. They shouted, they charged, they tried to intimidate, but the soldiers remained focused. The Marine noticed a pattern. The enemy was becoming predictable in their desperation. He signaled his men to exploit it. Suddenly, small shifts, perfectly timed movements, and bursts of rifle fire created chaos in the enemy's ranks. Soldiers who thought they had an opening were caught in crossfire, slowing the attack and giving the 40 men precious seconds to recover and adjust. The soldiers themselves began to feel a strange mixture of fear and determination. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, but the thrill of survival, and the realization that they were controlling the battle, gave them strength. One young private, who had been trembling earlier, now moved with precision, covering a gap and firing at the enemy with steady hands. Another soldier shouted, "We can do this," and the words echoed like a spark, boosting morale. The Marine's eyes never left the battlefield. He anticipated every movement, adjusted every position, and guided his soldiers with subtle gestures and quiet commands. Every time the enemy tried to break the line, they were met with unexpected resistance. Every time a wave faltered, the soldiers gained confidence. The impossible fight was still far from over, but they were holding. Time stretched endlessly. The valley became a chaotic theater of war, with dust, smoke, and cries of pain filling the air. The Marine soldiers were fighting not just for survival, but for the impossible. 40 men against 3,000, yet they had managed to turn fear into power, confusion into strategy, and desperation into courage. The enemy had not given up. More waves were forming, their numbers relentless. But the soldiers, though exhausted, stood firm. The Marine knew that the true test was coming. The forbidden Brig trick had held the enemy back, but only through the soldiers' courage, precision, and unity could they continue to survive. They had faced the impossible, and against all odds they were still standing. For the first time, a glimmer of hope shone through the fear. 40 men had held their ground against thousands. Their courage had turned a hopeless situation into a battle they could survive. And though the valley was still a battlefield of chaos, one thing was clear: the Marine and his 40 soldiers were more than just men, they were a force that could not be underestimated. The impossible fight continued. Against all odds they were still alive, and still fighting. The sun had climbed higher, burning through the smoke and dust that still hung over the valley. 40 soldiers, led by the Marine, had survived wave after wave of relentless attacks. Their bodies ached, their hands trembled from holding rifles too long, and sweat and grime covered every inch of their faces. Yet, despite exhaustion, something had changed. The impossible was slowly becoming possible. The Marine's eyes scanned the battlefield with sharp precision. He could see the enemy faltering, confused by the repeated illusions of strength and the deadly precision of his soldiers. The forbidden Brig trick, which had seemed impossible at first, was beginning to show its full power. The enemy had not anticipated it, and now, with every movement, every shift, the advantage was slowly turning in favor of the 40 men. The soldiers moved with a rhythm that was almost unnatural. Every shift, every step, every rifle shot was carefully timed to maintain the illusion of an army much larger than 40. To the bonsai warriors, it seemed as though more and more reinforcements were arriving, an unstoppable wall forming before them. The enemy hesitated, uncertainty creeping into their advance. The first cracks of doubt began to appear, and the Marine knew that this was the moment to act. He raised his hand subtly, signaling the next stage of the plan. The soldiers, though exhausted, understood instantly. They moved in perfect unison, creating gaps that the enemy believed were weaknesses, only to close them with precise, deadly force. Rifle fire came from unexpected directions, catching the enemy off guard. Warriors who had thought they could charge forward were suddenly trapped, their lines disrupted and chaotic. The Marine's heart pounded, not from fear but from the thrill of seeing the impossible unfold. The turning point had arrived. The enemy's confidence, once overwhelming, was beginning to crumble. Soldiers stumbled over each other in confusion. Their war cries turned to shouts of frustration as they realized the tiny group of 40 men was controlling the battlefield. Every time they tried to push through, they were met with the perfect combination of precision, movement, and illusion. The soldiers themselves could feel the shift in momentum. Fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into fierce determination. They had seen their efforts work. They had seen the enemy falter. Even the youngest soldiers, who had trembled with fear in the first clashes, now moved with courage and purpose. They fired with confidence, shifted with precision, and became the living embodiment of the Marines' plan. The Marines' eyes caught a crucial detail. A small group of enemy soldiers had broken formation, trying to flank the line. He didn't panic. Instead, he smiled grimly. This was exactly what he had anticipated. He signaled his soldiers to respond. Instantly, rifles flared from multiple angles, and the enemy group was forced back into confusion. What seemed like a dangerous maneuver became their trap. The forbidden trick had not just held the enemy, it was controlling them. The enemy tried again, regrouping and charging with desperation. But every attempt met the same result: confusion, hesitation, and deadly precision. 40 men, moving as one, had become a force that the enemy could not predict. The Marine knew that morale was shifting. Where the bonsai warriors had once been confident and terrifying, now doubt and fear were spreading among their ranks. Each hesitation was a victory. Each falter was a crack in what had seemed an impenetrable wave. The soldiers' confidence grew with each passing moment. They began to realize that their unity, their discipline, and the Marines' leadership could withstand almost anything. The trick was more than just a tactic. It was hope. And hope, in the chaos of war, was a powerful weapon. They had turned what seemed like a hopeless fight into a battle they could survive and even win. The Marines signaled a final adjustment in formation. The soldiers moved with quiet precision, closing gaps, shifting positions, and firing with deadly timing. The valley echoed with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the chaos of battle, but the 40 men remained focused, coordinated, and unstoppable. Every step, every movement reinforced the illusion that their numbers were far greater than reality. The bonsai warriors' hesitation grew into panic. Soldiers who had charged with full confidence were now unsure where to advance. Their lines wavered. Their attacks became uncoordinated. The Marine soldiers exploited every small mistake, pushing the enemy back slowly but surely. It was as if the tiny group of 40 men had become a wave, turning the tide of a battle that had seemed impossible. And then, finally, the moment came. The enemy began to retreat. Not all at once, but in small, chaotic groups. Confusion spread like wildfire. The Marine signaled his soldiers to hold firm and maintain their formation. They continued to fire, move, and create the illusion of greater strength. The enemy's morale collapsed completely, and the tiny group of 40 had done what no one thought possible. They had turned the battle in their favor. The soldiers looked at each other, exhausted but triumphant. Their fear was still there, but it had transformed into pride. They had survived the impossible. They had executed the forbidden trick perfectly. And they had proven that courage, unity, and clever tactics could overcome even overwhelming odds. The Marine took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield one last time. The turning point had passed. The enemy was in retreat, disorganized and demoralized. 40 men had held the line, controlled the battlefield, and turned fear into victory. What had seemed impossible at dawn was now reality. The battle was not over, but the impossible had been achieved. The Marines' plan had worked, and the 40 soldiers had proven that courage, precision, and unity could defy even the greatest enemy. Against all odds, the tide had turned. The valley was quiet now, but it was a quiet that carried the weight of war. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with the scent of gunpowder and dust. The cries of the wounded and the moans of the fallen had faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the occasional distant shout of retreating enemies. 40 men, led by their Marine, stood where the battle had raged, a line of survivors against impossible odds. The Marine lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes scanning the valley. His body ached from exhaustion, his hands were blistered, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Yet, despite the fatigue, there was a quiet pride in his eyes. He had led his men through something that no one thought possible. 40 men against 3,000 enemies. Against all odds, they had held the line, and now the enemy was in full retreat. The soldiers looked at each other, still breathing heavily, faces marked by fear, determination, and relief. Some sank to the ground, overwhelmed by exhaustion. Others simply stood, taking in the reality of what they had survived. They had faced death countless times in the last hours, and now, somehow, they were alive. Each man had played his part perfectly, trusting in the Marine's plan and the forbidden Brig trick. The Marine walked slowly among them, checking on every soldier. He offered quiet words of encouragement, a nod, a touch on the shoulder. "You did it." "We did it," he said simply. There was no celebration, no cheering, only the quiet acknowledgement that survival itself was a victory. These men had faced impossible odds and had come through. That was worth more than any medal. The battlefield told the story of the fight. Bodies of the fallen enemy lay scattered across the valley. Their advance had been relentless, but the trick, courage and precision of 40 men had turned it into a disaster for them. Dust swirled around, making the scene almost unreal. 40 men had become a wall. 40 men had turned fear into power. And 40 men had proven that even the smallest force could change the course of battle with skill and unity. The soldiers tended to the wounded as best they could. They shared water and words of comfort, keeping morale steady. The Marine oversaw everything, making sure no one was left behind, no one was forgotten. Even in the aftermath of victory, his mind was alert, scanning the horizon for any remaining threats. The enemy was scattered, but they had to remain vigilant. Survival required discipline even after triumph. Some of the soldiers began to realize what they had accomplished. Their fear, once overwhelming, had been replaced by something stronger: pride. They had executed a plan that seemed impossible. They had fought against overwhelming numbers and survived. They had not just defended themselves, they had turned the enemy's attack into a story of courage and strategy. And in that quiet moment, the weight of their achievement began to sink in. The Marine took a deep breath and looked toward the horizon. The valley had been a place of terror, a place where fear had ruled the hearts of men. Now it was a place of triumph, a place where courage had turned the tide. 40 soldiers had stood firm. 40 soldiers had defied the impossible. And the story of their fight, though marked by loss and hardship, would be remembered. He called his men together for a final check. They formed a line, weary but proud, facing the horizon where the enemy had once stood in overwhelming numbers. The Marine spoke quietly, but his words carried the weight of experience and leadership. "You fought like men who refused to give in. You trusted each other, you trusted me, and you survived. Today 40 men became a wall that even 3,000 could not break. Remember this moment. Remember your courage. You earned it." The soldiers nodded, some smiling weakly, some simply standing with quiet pride. They had endured a nightmare, yet they had come out alive. The Marines' trick, the plan no one believed could succeed, had worked perfectly. They had learned that strategy, unity, and courage could overcome the greatest odds. 40 men had stood against 3,000, and 40 men had prevailed. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and red, the Marine looked at the landscape. The battle was over. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind the evidence of their failure. The valley, once a place of terror, was now silent, holding the echoes of bravery and the proof of the impossible. The Marine and his 40 soldiers had not just survived, they had triumphed. And in that moment, amidst the smoke and dust, amidst the quiet cries and exhaustion, one thing was clear. Courage, unity, and clever strategy could turn even the most hopeless fight into a story of survival and victory. 40 men had faced death itself, and against all odds they had emerged victorious. The forbidden Brig trick had worked. The impossible had been achieved. And the 40 soldiers, led by their Marine, had proven that courage, discipline, and intelligence could triumph over overwhelming odds. The Marine looked at his soldiers one last time, a solemn smile on his face. "We did the impossible," he whispered. The valley, once a battlefield, now held the story of their courage. The story of 40 men, one Marine, and a trick that turned the tide of battle. And though the war would continue, this day, this moment, would be remembered forever. Victory had been won. Against all odds, courage had triumphed.